one of the things that you get criticized for a lot, well, it's more of a WWE revisionist thing, is, you let Mick Foley go, you let Steve Austin go, you let Triple H go, who were such big parts of the Attitude Era. Do you think that all three of those are fair criticisms to you, or do you think context is key?
Context is absolutely key in that respect. You have to look, individually. I let Mick Foley go because Mick Foley was determined. I liked Mick. Mick and I were friends. We socialized outside of wrestling a little bit. Our wives. I liked Mick, but Mick was determined to do things that were so high risk. And in some cases, not only to himself, well, for sure to himself, but he also put fans at risk. He put the company, Turner Broadcasting, at risk. He wanted to dive off balconies outside of the ring, on the ring apron, or on the floor outside of the ring. And there's always a chance that something could go wrong, and a fan sitting at ringside could get hurt. In a company like Turner Broadcasting, and I think it's different here in the UK. UK's got an interesting way of dealing with lawsuits and litigation. Is if I decide to sue Kenny and I win, good for me. But if I lose, I have to pay his attorney's fees. I think that's the way it is here in the UK. In the US, it's completely different. If I can find some scumbag creepy attorney that'll file a lawsuit against Kenny, he'll say, "Oh, I'm not going to charge you anything, Eric. We're just going to try to sue Kenny, and if we win, I'll take 30%, 33%, and if we lose, it doesn't cost you any money." That encourages frivolous lawsuits, and there's so much of that in the United States. And the bigger a company is, the more money they have, the deeper their pockets are, as they say in the States, the more likely they're going to be hit with frivolous lawsuits. And now I got a 300-pound guy that wants to jump off a balcony and splatter himself outside of the ring, and he may or may not hit somebody or hurt somebody that's at ringside. And I expressed that to Nick. I said, "Mick, we can't do a lot of the stuff that you want to do." And Mick, I think, took that personally, and as a result, he left. It wasn't personal to me. I liked Mick. It was just he was a risk to himself and also to the company. So that was Mick. Steve Austin, have any of you ever listened to Steve Austin's podcast? Yeah. I did. Steve called me up one time. This was years ago now, 5, 6, 7, 8. I don't even remember how long. It was a while ago. He had just started his podcast. Steve called me up. He goes, "Hey, man, next time you're in LA, I'd love to do a podcast with you." I said, "Sure, Steve, I'll call you." And I happen to, be out in LA on business a lot. So I called Steve. I went over to his house. We sat down. We did a podcast. We had a awesome time. I encourage you to go back and listen to our podcast. We actually did 2 of them over the course of 2 days. We did a 3-hour or 4-hour podcast one day, and it was so good, and we got so drunk. Steve called me as soon as I left his house. He goes, "Hey, man, do you think you can come back tomorrow and let's do another one?" I said, "Fine. You bring the beer, I'll bring me. We'll do it." And we did another one. And during that podcast, one of the things and it was so much fun. But one of the things Steve said was, "You know what, Eric? If I were you, I would have fired me too." And the reason I fired Steve is Steve was frustrated creatively, and that was understandable. He was kind of injury prone during that period of his career. I could have dealt with that. But what I couldn't deal with was there was a situation where Steve was out with an injury, and Steve was still very important to WCW, but I knew I couldn't put him in the ring. We were shooting TV at this little place called Center Stage, and I wanted to keep Steve visible. I wanted him to do an interview. I knew he couldn't wrestle, but I wanted the audience to hear from Steve Austin. So we created an interview for him and something he could say. And he wasn't scheduled for TV. He wasn't on the schedule. But I called Tony Schiavone into my office. I said, Tony, do me a favor, call Steve Austin, because Steve lived in Atlanta. He only lived about 15 minutes from where we were shooting TV. I said, ask him to come down, let him know we want to do an interview so that we can at least keep him visible, keep the audience interested in him. So Tony, and this is the way Tony explained it to me, Tony goes over, calls Steve Austin. Steve's wife answers the phone. Tony said, hey, this is, Tony Schiavone, and Eric Bischoff wants Steve to come down to center stage. And by the way, I was paying him. He was under salary. He was working for me. Kind of an important part of the story. And Tony says, he wants Steve to come down, do this interview. He doesn't have to wrestle, doesn't have to be in his gear. It's just a sit-down 2-minute interview. We just want to keep him visible on TV, keep his story alive. According to Tony Schiavone, as he's explaining this to Steve's wife, Steve says, oh, you want Steve to come down to center stage and do an interview? Tony's on the phone, and he can hear Steve Austin in the background saying, tell them sons of bitches I ain't coming anywhere. F them. Tony Schiavone comes back and says, Steve said, F you. I went, okay, that's how that goes. And the next morning I fired him. I sent him a FedEx. You're fired. Because legally I had to do that. Everybody makes a big deal out of the FedEx. But contractually, if you would have read Steve's contract or anybody's contract at that time, I could call him and tell him you're fired. But technically they weren't fired till they received a legal notice in either FedEx or some other form of mail where they had to actually sign for it and prove that they got it. And I fired him. That, not because I wanted to, but that was behavior that I couldn't allow to happen at that time. Who else did I can?
Triple H.
Yeah, Triple H, he was just starting out. He was good, but there's nobody that's going to be honest about it that can go back and look at Triple H in 1993 and go, oh, he's going to be a star. He married the boss's daughter. It is what it is, folks. I mean, I think this isn't going to do me any good.
Go on.
Look, I think Paul Levesque, Triple H, he's a student. He really is a student of the game. He is a great performer, but he's never been a Rock. He's never been an Austin. He's never been a Cena. He's been a great utility player at a certain level. And he's been around forever, but he's never been a superstar. But in 1993, I don't believe anybody that's really being honest can say, yeah, when I saw him in 1993, I knew he was going to be a big star. He just worked hard. He studied. He did the right things. He doesn't drink. He doesn't do drugs. He just studies professional wrestling, and he worked his way up to a point where he was able to break through because he was so consistent. He was so good and so consistent, but he was never great.